very pleased to host by through the internet is Anton Saifullaev, who is an assistant professor of East European Studies at the University of Warsaw. I believe he was at an event that I went to last fall. I think it was last October in Warsaw, but I don't recall exactly. So, in any event, he will be speaking about a subject that is of interest to me and also to others, including in Poland, Sławomir Łukasiewicz, Alexander Abramczuk, who are looking at the origins of Sovietology, Soviet studies, but also in the way the field evolved after the demise of the Soviet Union. So Anton will be talking about what some have referred to as former Soviet republics, but he's going to be talking in particular about Belarus and about how the demise of the Soviet Union affected the study of that former Soviet republic. So anyway, or Soviet Republic is let me turn to Anton, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Kramer. It's a big pleasure to be here, and thank you for invitation for this great event and great initiative. And yeah, I'm very glad to be here in a Davis Center, even virtually, but it's important place for today's topic, actually, origin for Belarusian studies. And actually, I will start my practical part of my presentation with actually the man who was very connected with this institution. Uh, I want to start, and I want to turn on my presentation. Yeah. Hopefully you see the presentation. Yeah, it's okay. Can you confirm it?
I don't see it, but I do see it, but it's not open yet.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. One more minute. Yeah, it should work right now.
Here it
Yeah,
is. Here it is. Okay.
perfect. Works. Yeah, it works. Yeah. Hello, everyone, once again, and thank you for being here today. And I want to talk today about something that might seem obvious at the first, but in reality, it's a topic that has been largely overlooked. My focus is on how knowledge about Belarus has been shaped within what we call Western epistemology. In simple terms, how has the West come to understand, or more accurately, misunderstand Belarus, maybe? Uh, the important part, why is important, why this topic is important and relevant for today. Well, given what's happening in Ukraine and the recent push to decolonization or decolonize Russian studies, it's more relevant than ever. Researchers are rethinking it, but despite some thought a Russian lens both geopolitically and culturally. Belarusian studies are a great example of an academic blind spot. Even though the Western governments founded researchers on the region for nearly half a century, the actual knowledge produced was minimal. But it's not just about what we know, it's also about how we know about Belarus and about post-Soviet countries in more broad context. If today I want to show you how Belarus has been conceptualized in global academic discourse, how its political, historical, cultural, and economic identity has been shaped by the way the West in the West. More importantly, I want to show how for decades academic discourse has trapped Belarus within outdated Soviet and Russian colonial narratives. And in light of current discussion we about this decolonization in the post-Soviet studies, we need to take a critical look at how this knowledge was constructed in the first place. At the beginning, I mentioned a paradox. This topic might seem obvious, yet uh, it has never been truly examined. Often seen as a small or insignificant, actually highlights how much work still needs to be done to move away from Russian-dominated perspective in Western academia. Uh, and first of all, I want to say that I'm not going to focus on the institutional history of Soviet and Slavic studies in the West, especially in the US, because frankly, Belarus was barely on the radar then, and it's still not a major focus today. Instead, I'll look at how Belarus has represented in English language academia, tracing the origins of these ideas. I will cover the role Russian ethnography and Russian historiography towards Belarus, which shared early Western perspectives on Belarus after the World War II. And even more, how these views carried over into the post-Soviet period. And because so few scholars have specialized in the Belarusian studies, I will highlight the work of some key individuals, some key person who shaped the field, whether for better or worse. It also essential to distinguish between interest in Belarus, Belarusian studies within Sovietology and Slavic studies, and the academic contribution of the Belarusian diaspora. The later body of work is substantial despite the relatively small size of the Belarusian diaspora in countries like United States. Today's talk will focus on the so-called academic discourse, what entered follows ethno-nationalist conventions. However, it also worth exploring how ethnic or native Belarusians attempt to participate in academic discourse, particularly in the United States. We will return to this topic later. Before I start the practical part of this presentation, I want to pay your attention to the title, especially to the part where the West is. The presentation touched on the Anglo-American Academy, which eventually became the defining force in understanding the production of knowledge about the USSR and its republics, even after its disintegration in 1991. Of course, one of the central places, or rather a project of the American government immediately after the war, was an institute for the study of the USSR, which operated in Munich from 1915 to 1972. The institute itself was very diverse, and there was also place for Belarusian researchers, rather representatives of intelligentsia, such as Jan Kostankevich, who published a book in 1956, The Soviet Falsification of History. This is the same year when Nicholas Vakar published his book, The Making of Nation, which was much more influenced to Slavic studies and Sovietology in the Belarusian regarding Belarusian case for many, many years ahead. Many representatives of the Russian immigration who were either directly engaged in the Belarusian question or in the context of Moscow's policy were also connected with the institute. My presentation does not contain a single word about institute, not because I consider it unimportant, but rather because if we look from the perspective of the functioning of the certain narrative, discourse, or even a format knowledge, which later became a determinant in the West about Belarus, we should turn our gaze to the USA first of all, or rather even a certain person. And when we want to start discussing this discussion on Belarusian studies in the West, the most obvious starting person is Nikolai Vakar or Nikolai Platonovich Vakar is a Russian white emigre in Paris and later Boston, a politician and a journalist for Последние новости. It's emigre newspaper in Paris, Russian emigre newspaper in Paris from Milukov circles. In the United States, he entered academia specializing in Russian philology, Sovietology, and history, and he was teaching at Harvard and Boston University and other institutions and universities. Vakar is a key person in understanding the early development of Belarusian studies, not only in the United States, but also within a broader English-speaking academic world. After moving to Boston during World War II, he established himself as an expert of nationalities, including the Ukraine and Belarus. His interest in Belarus seems to have emerged in late 30s at Harvard, the emigre activist in Paris. Uh,
Anton, Anton, your connection is cutting
only
in and out.
literature.
Anton,
And now, okay,
your connection is cutting in and out.
yeah,
So
okay. And
is
right
there
now it's okay.
now it's okay. I'm just worried that
Yeah,
it'll, but see if you can
yeah, I
somehow.
can
Okay.
a little bit. Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I go a little bit back and yeah, the interest, Vakar's interest in Belarus seems to have emerged in the late 30s, as documented in his notes at the Houghton Library in Harvard. In March 39, he met with Nikolai Abramchik, a Belarusian emigre activist in Paris. And only that point did he begin familiarizing himself with Belarusian language literature or uh, even more historiography. Given that by May 1939, he had already completed the manuscript of his book, The Belarusians, later published as the first monograph on Belarus in 1956. If it evident that his prior knowledge of Belarusian historiography and literature was pretty minimal before he wrote his book. After his meeting with Abramchik, he wrote, uh, "At home, I read the literature which Abramchik gave him with curiosity. It was difficult until my eye was attracted to writing phonetically too precise and therefore a bit silly. I left behind in Ukrainian, but it is working out and catching up quickly. The lack of familiarity with Belarusian historiography and literature is clearly visible visible in Vakar's first academic publication on Belarus from 1949. He begins his article with a statement, the term Belarusia, and pay your attention that for this time, the more accurate term for Belarus is Belarusia. The term Belarusia, because this double S, is not well known outside the Slavic world. Vakar continues this kind of discovering of the Belarus by explaining the difference between white Russians and white movement and civil war era in Russia. Vakar also explores the origins of the name White Ruthenia, Belarus, carrying out a historical analysis of this color-based terminology used about Ruthenia. In doing so, he draws on key works from the colonial body of text about Belarus from the imperial period. He references the research of Yefim Karsky and Osip Turchinovich, as well as Ukrainian scholars and historians Alexander Potebnya or Mikhailo Grushevsky. Among these sources, he also cites Geographia Belarusi, the Geography of Belarus, published in 1925 by Arkad Smolich, the first author of Geography of Belarus, and pretty recognizable research in the Belarusian context. In fact, this was the only explicit Belarusian source included in his work. However, the bibliography used in Vakar's text can also be understood as a transfer of knowledge, specifically Russian colonial knowledge, into the space of West Slavic studies. Eva Thompson describes these established Slavic institutes. These were essentially Russian studies program and research centers. American University really welcomed emigres from Russia into these centers. It was many of them were anti-Bolsheviks, activists, members of white movement, representatives of Russian aristocracy, politicians, who went on to occupy key academic position in Slavic and Soviet studies in the US. Drawing on their existing knowledge, primarily pre-revolution Russian historiography, Nicholas Vakar directly contributed to the transfer of pre-Soviet colonial discourse on Belarus, such as the Western Russian perspective or Zapadnorusism, into Western academia. This explains ethnographicism, so-called ethnographicism towards Belarus in an article published in the 1949, which was characterized by a kind of intellectual discovery in the condition of lack of knowledge. Vakar's memoirs confirm this, as he was actively engaged not only in the life of the emigre community, but also maintaining contacts with American partners abroad, for example. One such person was Malcolm Davis, a representative of Carnegie in Europe, at the time, who, according to Vakar, was interested in the nationality question in Russia. This interest led to an attempt just before the war in Paris to establish the Society for the Study of Nations or Nationalities of Russia, Общество изучения народов России. Though the initiative ultimately failed before the German invasion. Once in Boston, Vakar became actively involved in academic life at Harvard and Boston University, where he contributed to the development of the courses and publications focused on nationalities issue within what was referred to as Russia or USSR. Vakar's book, Belarusia, The Making of Nation, a case study. This book has an interesting history, and it was most influential in shaping Western knowledge about Belarus. Initially completed in 1939, as I said, the manuscript was left behind in Paris, later recovered before the German invasion of France. It was later shared with the US State Department in the 40s, earning Vakar $400 payment. After the war, he revised it to feed the academic language of the US, or more westernized this book. The making of nation was well received within the rapidly expanding fields of American Slavic studies and Sovietology. Moreover, in the long run, at least until 1991, this book became a standard reference on Belarus. What kind of knowledge Wacker proposed in his book? It is important to note that Wacker's book provided a relatively comprehensive summary of knowledge about Belarus as we can imagine it in my mid 50s. However, this knowledge was framed through a colonial Western Russian, Западно-русская perspective, repacked in the academic language of Western ethnography and Sovietology. Wacker's book contains many elements of the narrative on Belarus that persist today and certainly remained influential immediately after the collapse of the USSR. One of the central argument in his book was the idea of Belarus as an unfinished nation with unfinished national culture, language, literature, and so on, and state or society, culture, language in between, position between the West represented by aggressive, according Wacker's book, Poland, and the East, Russia. In the post-Soviet period, this very thesis became one of the dominant narratives further developed and promoted by another Russian scholars of Belarus, Grigory Yoffe, who essentially modified Wacker's ideas to fit the realities of the post-Soviet state. Beyond the language itself, Wacker's choice of terminology was tells us about his approach. For instance, when describing the medieval period, he uses the term West Russia instead of the already established academic terms Ruthenian or Rus. The semantic attachment to Russia, reinforced through terminology, was accompanied by a dualistic framework that positioned Belarus in a contrast to an expansionist, so-called expansionist Poland. Overall, Wacker adopts a historical chronology drawn from Western Russian literature, which is a part of broader colonial body of knowledge on Belarus. Wacker's attitude towards Belarus national historiography and nationalism was somewhat condescending on the one hand, on the other, yet neutral and understanding on the other. However, it is important to note that in the end, Nicholas Wacker and his scholarly contribution were not, so to speak, morally accepted by a Belarusian diaspora. The diaspora itself never truly entered the Sovietological mainstream and remained on the margins of immigrant communities from the USSR. But I will return to this question, to this point, more detail later. There are several important points to highlight regarding Wacker's book on colonial. Oh, it's once again unstable connection. Can you hear me? I have a. Hopefully, yes. This literature, this Western Russian body
It's
of
still
text.
most of the time I can hear you okay, Anton, but it does keep
But
cutting in and out a couple of
yeah,
times.
I'm
Not
so
as
sorry
badly as before, but it still is
for
doing it.
for my connection. Okay, for these connection troubles, but it's not fully my fault.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
and once again, highlighting the very key points of Wacker's book and his contribution. The literature used a primarily colonial Western Russian body of text, along with more recent Soviet publication, including journals. Some of these arguments were formulated in broad, generalized terms, essentially without direct source support and tailored to fit his conclusions. This is especially evident in his discussion of the medieval and early modern periods, where description of economic structure, daily life, and customs really heavily on the ethnographic literature of the Russian Empire. Westernization of the narrative. For example, a completely out of context chapter appears on racial theory concerning the origins of Belarusians, depicting them in Belarusian scholarly literature as pure Slavs. In this case, Vaco references Всеволод Ignatovsky, the Belarusian scholar who had never actually advocated for racial theory or something like that, framing Belarusians within Western ethnographic and national building concepts. This led to two fundamental assumptions that became rooted in Western academic stereotypes and semantic limitation concerning Belarus for a very, very long time, even now. The idea of an unfinished nation, and the second one, Belarus as a state in between, geopolitically, culturally, economically, and so on, between West and East, mostly between Poland and Russia. And despite its flaws, Vakar's book and his overall work on Belarus gained significant recognition within Slavic and Soviet studies. It is also fair to acknowledge that Nicholas Vakar undertook a monumental effort in systematizing of bibliography on Belarus across multiple languages and historical periods. Uh, in his bibliographic work, which was published in 1956, in the same year as this book, is his monograph book. Vakar completed sources about Belarus and about Belarusian context in Russian, Polish, Belarusian, German, English, French languages. His bibliography included approximately 2,000 systematically categorized entries. And this bibliographical guide was published in the Russian Research Center at Harvard too, as his monograph book, The Making of Nation. Moreover, his research was often treated as an objective and positively received by overseeing government structures. In many ways, the Belarusian experience mirrored that of the other nation from the former Russian Empire in Belarusian history, was absorbed into the broader Russian emigre narrative, which was recognized by Western authorities as a legitimate voice representing the Soviet Union and the former empire. Vakar's case clearly demonstrates this dynamic. He even states outright of his memoirs. Already in Paris years, the white Russian emigre community held a strong and stable political position, exerting significant control on academic, journalistic, political, and ultimately scholarly debates. The Belarusian emigre community, on the other hand, lacked the political and financial leverage to establish itself as an influential academic entity. As a result, in the US, it remained largely on the margins of the academic mainstream. However, before discussing the emigre entirety and remaining in the US, it should be noted that in 50s defined an increasingly dominant research current of the consequence that can be described as a Sovietological. This refers to studies of Belarus as a periphery of Soviet Empire. While Vakar largely represented Belarus from a broader cultural, historical perspective, demographical perspective, relying on colonial texts from the imperial era, the Sovietological approach focuses on the new Soviet formation and its various entities, including nationalities issues. In this context, it should be noted two important works. The first one is Zbigniew Brzezinski's monograph, The Permanent Purge, Politics in the Soviet Totalitarianism, in which the author discussed the purges and repressions in Belarus within the context of the Soviet Union, often placing it alongside Ukraine. Brzezinski analyzed the new phenomenon of purges against the backdrop of growing Soviet totalitarianism. Not only does he provide a detailed examination of the available sources, but he also introduced a categorization and typology of political purges. In the Belarusian context, Brzezinski also analyzed a Belarusian Communist Party elite. A detailed description of them appeared in his monograph, and it's one of the most biggest and the best achievement of this book. Disregarding the contextual nature of description of Belarus, however, Brzezinski's work contributed much to the understanding of institutional construction of Belarusian Soviet Republic and became one of the fundamental books on Soviet Belarus. The significance of Brzezinski's work in the Belarusian context is also mentioned by John Armstrong in his critical review of the book by Belarusian-born researcher Ivan Stefanovich Lubachka, Belarusia, because double S, under Soviet rule 1917-1957. The piece of this review is above this upper one. Uh, yeah, this book was published in 1962 by the University of Kentucky. Lubachka's book primarily focused on the Soviet period of Belarusian statehood and ends in 1957, as Armstrong fairly pointed out in his review. It is not clear why Lubachka gives this year as his terminal date. In historical section of the work, Lubachka largely repeats the transfer of the Russian colonial narratives about Belarus. This transfer mainly involves using previous works, such as those by Nicholas Vakar, George Vernadsky, or colonial authors like Efim Karsky. When describing the historical part, for example, the author then focuses on the description of the Soviet elites in Belarus, the territorial division, presenting a pro-Soviet narrative, for example, in a reference to the eastern provinces of the Poland annexed by USSR in 39. And the internal situation during the after World War II he presented in his book too. Ivan Lubachka also draws both Soviet and emerging literature, maintaining certain distance from the nationalist-centered vision, which seems to be influenced by certain epistemological limitations. Lubachka's book was received quite critically within the Sovietological community. Interestingly, but positive reviews were often mixed with the comments pointing out that the book had many errors in terminology and the factual inaccuracies. On the one hand, there were a very critical reviews, such as those by John Armstrong in a Slavic Review or Alan Pollard in the Historian Journal, where the reviewer stated outright that Lubachka's book doesn't compare to Vakar's work. On the other hand, there were also positive reviewers, for example, from Viktor Sukhiditsky or John Sadowski from Queen's University, John or Janka Sadowski, uh, who argued that due to the absolute lack of information on the topic, Lubachka's book was incredibly valuable. In fact, the study became one of the few that truly addressed the Belarusian part of Sovietology. With no doubt, it remained overshadowed by works like Vakar's and Brzezinski's. The life and career of Ivan Lubachka largely remain not so much unknown, but not considered in terms of one of the creators of Belarusian studies in the US. He came from Belarus, from Polsk region, and during the war he was sent to work in Germany, but after the war he never returned home. In the 50s, he emigrated to the US, and unlikely many Belarusian immigrants in the US, he did not study the Catholic University in Louvain right after the war, but instead went to Columbia University and earned his PhD in Indiana University. And right after that, he worked at Murray State University. The work by Lubachka I mentioned was his doctoral dissertation. On the University of Kentucky's publishing site, we can find that Ivan Lubachka, a native Belarusian, is a professor of history at Murray State University. This is largely true in the sense within that vast Sovietological landscape of the Cold War era. Lubachka was perhaps the only or one of the very few native Belarusian scholars who made a name for himself in a dynamically developing field of Sovietology and presented the Belarusian somehow presented this Belarusian perspective also he was limited by available literature and local epistemology. The above mentioned University of Louvain played a significant in Belgium played a significant role in becoming an academic hub for Belarusian immigrants, including those in the United States and the United Kingdom. When speaking about the post-war less Belarusian intellectual elite that emerged abroad, it is important to mention Yanka Zaprudnik, obviously. Who in 1969 defended his PhD on Belarusian political struggles in Russian Duma in the early 20th century at New York University. Zaprudnik and later Kippel family were associated with all the central themes and topics of Belarusian historiographical discourse in the United States. When we are speaking about the diaspora centered mainly in New York and New Jersey in the US, we must address the so-called non-Sovietological trend, which can even described as an historical romantic one. If we analyze the historiography of Belarusian post-war immigration in the US and the UK, we can see that it ties back to native-based conceptual historiography. In other words, the contribution of the diaspora undoubtedly had and should have a political and separatist foundation to Russia. Emigre literature from 50s and 60s serves as evidence of this. Among its creators were also active political figures and activists from the period of Second Polish Republic, interwar Poland, such as Jan Stankiewicz, for example, was a deputy. He was a deputy of Polish Sejm in interwar period. Pre-war emigre activists like Nikolai Abramczyk, who appears in Vakar's memoir, Viktor and Radoslaw Ostrovsky, Janka Sadowski, and etc. In some cases, these were individuals who had previously collaborated with German administration during the World War II. However, I would be very cautious in labeling migratory literature or historiography as a part of Belarusian studies within the context of Soviet or Slavic studies, academic mainstream. Many works by diaspora activists were outside the academic mainstream, often self-published by small presses. Their reach was primarily within the diaspora itself, among certain interested researchers, and up until at least mid-16th, the literature had an over-political undertone. As Evgeny Kodin, a Russian researcher of this topic, notes, the founding and publishing activities largely came from the US Department of State. In the 50s, there were two CIA programs directed to Belarus, which were shut down in 1961 due to their lack of effectiveness. During this period, with the financial backing from these programs, publishers and periodicals were active, not only creating a discourse that mobilized the diaspora, but also establishing a continuous format of knowledge about Belarus. This effort was never fully realized, as emigre communities remained largely separate from the mainstream academic circles. Only a handful of diaspora members managed to establish notable academic careers. Jan Kazaprudnik is perhaps one of the most recognizable person in this regard. He earned his doctorate at New York University, as I said, and later he was teaching Russian history at City University of New York in 70s. Zaprudnik also had a connection with Ukrainian, he was trying to provide and find connection with Ukrainian academics uh, and the intellectual circles working to promote a non-Russo-centric perspective, more national, ethnic national perspective on Belarus and in a broader context, Eastern Europe. However, in the mainstream Sovietological and Slavic journals, Zaprudnik appeared only once before 1991, in 1965, in nationalities papers with an article, Problems in Terminology, and in the periodization of Belarusian history in original. Which was based on a paper delivered at the symposium and a very similar title. In this article, Zaprudnik briefly summarized what can be considered national historiography. In any case, this is one of the few cases when the Belarusian researcher drawing on his cultural discursive baggage and published it in pretty important academic journal for that time. When talking about North America, we should remember about Janka Sadowski, also as known Sadowski to the left, to the right side or side of the slide. He was born in Belarus and served as a Polish army force in 40s. In July 46, he arrived in United Kingdom. He earned his PhD in Rome in 49. In the 60s, he moved to United States and later to Canada, where he was teaching Russian language and culture and literature at the University of Illinois in Chicago and after at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. In 1981, he published a history of Belarusians in Canada. He specialized in the early modern period, publishing several articles on topic including Belarusian culture in 16th centuries in Canadian Slavonic paper in 1970. The post-war transfer of colonial narrative gradually became consolidated within Sovietology. Moreover, within the central academic discourse, Belarus was represented in a very peripheral way. Later Sovietization of the discourse, like in 60s, 70s, about Belarus focused not only so-called contextual text about the country, but also on text exclusively about Belarus. The Sovietized terminology of the subject's literature was used in text directly dedicated to Belarusian topics. One such example of Sovietization can be seen in the term Western Belarus or Western Belarusia, a term referring to areas annexed by USSR and consequently included in the Belarusian Soviet Republic after the Soviet attack on Poland on September 1939. This term originated within communist circle active in the eastern part of Poland and gradually migrated into academic language, especially after September 39, justifies the Soviet aggression against Poland and legitimizing the so-called recovery of Belarusian and Ukrainian territories. In Slavic and Sovietological literature, the term in the West, the term Western Belarus or Western Belarusia appears alongside Western Ukraine. For instance, Roman Shparluk uses terminology while also explaining that it only began to function in 1921 after the Polish-Soviet War. In fact, Roman Shporluk was one of the most active Ukrainian researcher of Belarusian trade within Sovietology and Slavic studies. In the 70s, he published several articles directly devoted to Belarusian topics or concerning often in comparative manner studies with Ukraine. When we're talking about Western English-speaking academy, it's important to mention the diaspora community in London and the general interest in Belarus in the UK. The post-war interest in minorities from the former Russian Empire in the UK was relatively low, but the attitude was loyal. This is highlighted by Evgeny Kodin, the Russian scholar. Currently, he's probably the rector of University of Smolensk. And like 20 years ago, not so long. I mean, it's 20, 50 years ago. He studied this topic and points it out in a specific Russian way and published articles about Belarusian studies in the US and UK in 20s, like in 2022, 2023, with obvious ideological framework of current Russia, current historical science and historical discipline in Russia. And this is something we can discuss further. But this statement can be agreed upon. In 1954, the Anglo-Belarusian Society was founded, becoming a key institution for diaspora. It played a central role in shaping the intellectual and publishing life of Belarusian community in the UK. From 60s and the late 80s, academic knowledge exchange about Belarus was and could say much more developed than at universities in the US. Now, on the one hand, there was a strong interest and involvement from the local British scholars, among whom linguist Shirin Akiner, for example, or literary scholars Arnold Macmillan or Jim Dingley. In addition to their academic work, they were active members of Belarusian community in London, supporting and collaborating with them. Equally important was development of non-Soviet Belarusian studies within academia in the UK in the collaboration with the diaspora. One of the result of this cooperation was a journal, the Journal of Belarusian Studies, which was published irregularly from 1965 to 1988 and was revived in 2013. One of the most significant Belarusian collection outside Belarus and Russia are held at the Francis Karina Belarusian Library in London, founded in 1981. The tendency of cooperation between the academy and diaspora has continued even developed. While the local interest in Belarus remains small, it is steady and I could say authentic, with ongoing close collaboration with the diaspora. Even now, after 2020, for example, Belarusian initiative emerged
Anton, you've broken off. You've broken off.
Chatham House.
Okay.
Belarusian studies are still that the number of, yeah, okay, yeah, and yeah, I have information that the internet is bad. Is it true? Can you hear me? Can you confirm?
It's okay now.
Yeah, it's
It's
okay.
okay
It's
now.
okay now. Okay. Yeah, and important to note that the number of Sovietological texts in Slavic and Soviet journals was relatively small. Also, the overall number of articles on Belarus between 45 and 1991 was very low compared to the amount of text about Russia or Ukraine, for example, or even Lithuania. Interestingly, that the topic of about and of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is central for Belarusian national historiography, was rarely associated with Belarus in Anglo-Saxon historical and Slavic studies. It was instead often linked to historiography of modern Lithuania. Between 1945 and 1991, Soviet studies published 5 texts directly discussing Belarus, and Slavic Review had only 2 articles on topic in the same period. These numbers do not include didn't include few book reviews on Belarusian topics. The remaining presence of Belarus in these journals was mostly fragmentary and contextual reference in articles focused primarily on the history of Russia and the USSR. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, Belarus practically disappeared from the mainstream of post-Sovietology and Slavic studies in the West. In 90s, there were almost non-monographic or research article on Belarusian topic in key of Slavic journals or those dedicated to Eastern Europe and broader post-Soviet context. Analyzing the content of 7 Slavic and post-Soviet journals between 1991 and 2001, the decade following the dissolution of the USSR, one can find only 9 articles focused on Belarus. Book reviews and other brief contextual works were not taken into account. The analyzed journals include Slavic Review, former Soviet Studies, the Europe-Asia Studies, Canadian Slavonic Paper, the post-Soviet affairs, and so on. Western knowledge about Belarus in the first 15 years after the collapse of the USSR was very contextual, mainly framed within the Russian and Russo-Soviet context. Also, it was nothing. It should be noted that compared to the Cold War period, the discourse about Belarus expanded significantly. It was still quite limited. It was still quite limited, but expanded significantly. In the 90s, the few publications about Belarus can be characterized on the one hand as the following mainstream research trends on the region, such as the collapse of the USSR, Chernobyl, or Holocaust studies, or Stalinist repression. On the other hand, there were sporadic texts placing Belarus in the comparative context, for example, comparing identity, society, or politics with other post-Soviet countries. In the first decade after the collapse of the USSR, more collective works and monographs on Belarus appeared actually in these 10 years. But in comparison with Russia and or Ukraine, for example, the scope and number of publications were very, very limited. In the context of two books by David Marples, one of the first and few Belarusian study researchers in the West stand out. Marples had been publishing text on Belarus since the late 80s. An important trend in Slavic and post-Soviet studies after 1991 was increasing presence of so-called native researchers, post-Soviet researchers, Russians, Ukrainians, less Belarusian scholars settling in academic positions in the US, Canada, and Western Europe. Uh, and the main conclusions, because we have less time to 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 present and expert of Belarus in the West was she Russian, Soviet. The main actors responsible for this colonial transfer were Russian immigrants, first of all, who had better access to symbolic, political, and economic resources. And it remains pretty similar situation right now, actually. The knowledge about Belarus from the end of World War II, once again, the information that the connection unstable. Can you hear me?
It
Probably
cuts
yes.
a little bit
Yeah.
in and out, but go ahead. I
Uh,
think you're okay
yeah.
now.
Yeah. Just 1 minute more.
Mhm.
Knowledge about Belarus from the end of World War II until 1991 and the first decade after was very fragmentary and contextual, meaning was framed within Russian history. Very few detailed studies were produced. As a result, Vakar's book on Belarus had a status of a canonic or like a textbook until the late 80s, even in the beginning of 90s. A positive, a little positive moment, an example is the UK. However, this did not take on political potential and remained at local level, political and actually expert level. And the last one, and pretty obvious point, that the Belarusian diaspora had a much weaker position, and the intellectual discourse focused on national-centered knowledge formats, which rarely made it into the Slavic and Sovietological mainstream because they were considered non-scientific and not accepted by a strong Russian immigration. Uh, yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Anton. The connection did break in and out a fair amount, but no, I think the thrust of the presentation was quite clear. So I don't think it posed too great problem for the audience. The in terms of a couple of questions, you skipped past a slide that you had that looked at that referred to CIA operations because yesterday I hosted a seminar on CIA operations in Western Ukraine in the 1940s. And could you say a little bit about that? I mean, I know that there was much less activity that occurred in Belarus, or what was then called Belarusia, but could you say a little bit about that? I
Mhm.
also had a second question, which I guess is a fairly obvious one, but still I want to ask it, which is the Belarus for the last 31 years has been ruled by the same president, and there have been periodic bouts of protest against him. Nonetheless, he has not lost power, and he has turned over a great deal of sovereignty to Russia itself, especially which began during the Yeltsin years, but particularly under Putin has accelerated. So you would think that there would be considerable popular resentment against that. Why do you think that there really has not been a full-scale movement to dislodge Lukashenko? And there are certainly individuals who have led protests and tried to do it from afar, but it's certainly there's no indication that it will succeed anytime soon. And then one final question with regard to the study of Belarus, could you say you looked at the patterns in journal, especially in Western journals? Can you say a bit about how Belarus was conceived of in Russian and Ukrainian journals as well? That is, were they looking at some of the same topics that were discussed in Western journals? Were they discussing Belarus's connections with their republics, or were they looking at something else? So please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your question, and actually, it's quite large ones. But I will try to briefly present, especially on your second question, because it's more about the whole situation. About CA operation, I can share the article. It's open access article by Evgeny Kodin. Actually, he wrote more about this, about personalities who was involved from Belarusian side, for example. And he described the structure that it was exist like 10 years or something like that. It had a budget like $10 million for publishing. It was pretty much involved people who was collaborated with German administration during the war. And yeah, but if we are reading these articles by Evgeny Kodin, we should note that yeah, like some kind of limitation in language, it still remains this uh, colonial trajectory of
You're breaking off, Anton.
uh, regional status of Belarus abroad too. I'm so sorry for my connection.
No, that's
Can you
all
hear
right.
me?
That's all right. We'll
Yeah,
try
can
to
you
make
hear me
do
right
with it.
now? Yeah. I'm so sorry for my connection. It's quite yeah. I'm very yeah.
Uh,
It's unexpected article. We should yeah to take in mind historical science tradition, and it's more like you can meet these like terms fascist or a national or anti-Russian quotes or something like that. But there are a lot of there are a lot of source information in his articles about that. And yeah, it was like a very short period for this CA operation for these programs. They tried to send people in Belarus actually, and there are some reports about how a few agents which was sent it to Belarus. They operated, what they are did, and how they were acting in the country in the 50s. But it was yeah, it was closed because was ineffective actually. And it's a very interested like when Belarusian emigre people, personalities had this budgets from CIA for doing so, that was quite half military organization actually, because as I said, some people from the former German collaboration with Germany in the World War II period was appeared in these projects, and they trained agents. They had this military part of these programs, but at the same time, it was a huge developing of the publications, journals, the diaspora life to contribute some kind of this identity stuff for very unstable Belarusian identity in the mid 50s, because a lot of Belarusians in the US, in the UK, in the Western Europe identified themselves as a like Poles or Russians or Ukrainians, and it was hard to build this community. But yeah, it was like closed in 1961, and if you want, I can send you these articles. Yeah, it's pretty interesting in this regard and connected with the origins regarding according I'm sorry coding. It's very connected with origins of Belarusian studies in the US, in the UK, in the UK. The second question is about if we're talking about Belarus and the whole situation. Mm, yeah. Okay, maybe I will try to answer on the last one because it's pretty connected with the topic of presentation. And
Um, uh, Anton, you're breaking off, so let me
it's quite
intervene, and because my last question,
interesting in Russia.
let me just also combine my question with a few questions from the audience, which is so you can deal with all of these together or individually
Yeah,
as you
sure.
wish.
Yeah.
Were there any cases where specific works, that is, academic works or personalities, individual scholars, or schools of Belarusian studies influenced political decisions? I assume the questioner means political decisions in Belarus, but maybe in the West. And in your opinion, what shapes Western media perspectives on Belarus? And then a second questioner asks, have you noticed changes in Belarus related knowledge production or academic scholarship since 2020? And I would assume probably referring especially since 2022. Um, and then a third questioner asks, can you explain the White Russian part of the story? What is the connection? And again, that I think you did explain, but if you could add a little bit more about it.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. And yeah, it's pretty intertwined. If we're talking about Russian journals, for example, Russian discourse about Belarus, it's quite different. I can say that it's more like neo Western Russian study, something like that. It's more developed than it was before, for example, because Soviet period has changed a lot actually in the Belarusian case. But still, after 1991, if we are talking about, for example, history, because after 1991, I have this kind of feelings that Belarus was disappeared from the Russian historiography in the question, for example, about politics, geopolitics, relations with Poland or Grand Duchy of Lithuania. In the case of wars like Livonic War, and the discourse about Belarus, academic discourse about Belarus in Russia, I can describe as neo Western Russian, neo Западно-русский, like more. It's yeah, and it's obviously official discourse. I would say there are more tendencies. towards to Eurasian narrative, for example, and include Belarus in the Eurasian context too. Uh, in the case of Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian academic discourse, uh, I think that it's pretty weak. It's not a huge discussion between academic fields. I mean, between Belarusians in Belarus and Ukrainians in Ukraine. Maybe more discussion and debates and contexts about 20th century or about being together in the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. We can find abroad in the West or Central European academia, like in Poland, for example. But this context, academic context, and the discourse about Belarus and Ukraine after 1991, I can say that it's pretty weak and it's limited by very specific archaeological field, for example, or very specific and very precise articles or narratives about the life in medieval or daily life or medieval or something like that. Nothing what should influence on the politics or society in this regard. I think has been no established. In the regard of 2020, actually 2022, it was actually confirmed it. I mean that the knowledge about Ukraine in Belarus and the knowledge about Belarus in Ukraine was very, very poor. I mean, very weak. It was pretty obvious when, for example, Ukrainian analytics or academians tells like the story like about Belarusian history, not
Um,
you know so much or something like that. The situation after uh,
you're cutting in and out again, Anton. Um, let me, if I could, I hope you can hear me, is let me add another question from the audience, which is, are there any current studies of how
yeah, and
are there
yeah.
any current studies of how Belarusians' perceptions of themselves as not Russian has changed after 2020?
Mhm. I will try to answer on this question and connect it, intertwine this question with the previous one about the knowledge production since 2020. Since 2020, situation was a little bit changed, but the reaction of the Western Academy was pretty. It's unsurprisingly for Belarusian researchers, for example, but it was quite a big surprise for the researchers from the Slavic studies field or post-Soviet studies, because the protest as an event was pretty unacceptable. It was like a very huge reaction, a huge, surprising reaction about social dimension of protest, political dimension, digital and cultural dimensions of this protest. And it was a good time. I mean, it was a good time for expanding academic discourse and expanding academic texts about Belarus. A few researches was established actually. And many PhD doctoral students appeared in the Western universities actually, and it was a pretty cool movement. I mean, movement ahead. But after 2022, situation has been changed again, and Ukraine was on the first plan, and the primary field of study regarding to Slavic studies and post-Soviet studies. And Belarus was again came back to this contextual and fragmentary knowledge, more geopolitical, more expertise of very, very current situation without explanation why the society reacts in this way, how, I don't know, cultural or historical predisposition for doing so. And this tendency after 2020 was more or less after 2022. And if we are talking about, yeah, the current studies of Belarusians' perception of themselves as not Russian has changed after 2020 a little bit. In the Western Academy, yes, I hopefully I can say that the Belarusian scholars and the people who actually involved in Belarusian studies field try to learn about Belarus and study Belarus without this very Russocentric lens. But institutionally, it's very hard to provide or to get some position, for example, in Western US Academy. It's hard to find any kind of fellowship or internship or something like that with Belarusian case, because mostly it was about Ukraine, but it remains that the Russian topics will be the main one in the nearest future. And with Belarusian topic, if you want to get some position in the West institutions, in the US or UK or the France, for example, in Germany, you should connect this Belarusian context with the Russian one. You should study the Belarus example throughout the lens of Russia and Moscow politics. Uh, yeah. Uh, can you explain the White Russian part of the story? Uh, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I can say that it was more about. It's connected with Nicholas Vakar article about White Russia, the name of White Russia, it's called, because in the literature and the historiography before the war and a bit after war in the 40s and the late and the early 50s, the main term to define Belarusia or Belarus was White Russia. Even more in 90s, even more in 21st century, for example, in German, it was still used the Vice Russland, like White Russia term in Sweden, in Swedish, and so on. And the Belarusian state, the Lukashenko's Belarusian state, did a lot to change it, to change this international pronounce of Belarus. And that is why, for example, if you want to find something about Belarus, it's much more simpler to find writing Belarus than Belarusian. You know, 20 years ago, the situation was completely different. And the White Russian is, yeah, and this a little bit confused by this article that, and Vakar's writes in his article that White Russia is not the same like White Russians who was fighting during the civil war in Russia.
Yeah, no, inevitably there will continue to be confusion, I think, about the name. I'm very glad, though, that you went through some of the etymological origins of both the name and then the origins of Belarusian studies. I certainly hope that the field will flourish in the future, ideally with a more democratic society in Belarus. But so I want to thank you very much, Anton. Overall, everything worked fine. You know, the cutting in and out did not last long enough. I think, particularly with your presentation on the screen, that people had a very good sense of what you were presenting. And I look forward to having you at some point in person at Harvard as well. So let me thank you very much for your presentation and also thank the audience, a series of very good questions. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much for invitation, and I'm really sorry for my internet connection, but
Don't worry, it's
hopefully
happened
it
before.
was it was
It's
good.
happened
Thank you very
before. You're
much.
not the first one.
Thank you very much,
Bye for now.
Professor Kramer. Thank you all of you.